I stopped at the traffic light to buy bread. 5 minutes, I told myself. 5 minutes that stretched into a slow, impossible second when the car beside mine rolled forward and I saw him, my husband, laughing with a woman I didn't know. There are images that carve themselves into you like a brand. The red of the traffic light, his head thrown back in a laugh that belonged to someone else, sunlight hitting a small hoop earring against the other woman's ear. He had sunglasses on, she had red nails. He didn't even glance my way. For a moment, my brain could not assemble the scene into meaning. I felt both outside my body and pinned inside it, like a spectator at a movie where the script had been changed without my consent. I did not slam on the horn, I did not shout. I kept my hands folded on the steering wheel until the light changed and both cars moved on. That was the first decision, silence. Not because I did not want to scream, but because I knew the theater of a scene would give him an advantage. Anger in the street would have been his performance to manipulate, silence would be mine. After I pulled into the supermarket parking lot, my hands searched the car automatically and found, in the glove compartment between a coupon and an old receipt, a tiny gold hoop. It was not mine. It smelled faintly of perfume. If that earring had not been there, I might have convinced myself I had only imagined what I'd seen. That small, ordinary thing made everything real. At home, I sat at the kitchen table and let the noon light flatten the rest of the day into one long, careful breath. My husband texted later, some casual line about running late. He always texted casually. The normalcy of his message was another sting. I remember thinking, this man can be two things at once. The person who empties the dishwasher and tells the kids a bedtime story, and the person who sits next to someone else with a hoop earring glinting in the sun. To hold both images at once made my head ache. I made the second decision then. I would not explode in public. I would not be the woman who lost herself in a grocery store parking lot. I would watch, collect, and wait. That choice felt like armor, dignity as strategy, and it shaped everything that came after. The next few days were a blur of small observations that stitched into pattern. He came home smelling faintly of a perfume he didn't wear. His phone kept facing down in the living room as if whatever was happening needed to be shielded from the ordinary light. I stopped waiting for an apology I didn't know I deserved. Instead, I started to notice details. Receipt dates didn't match stories about errands. Lunch breaks were longer than necessary. Little things that once seemed like the harmless chaos of adult life began to look like a coordinated performance. I slept badly, that's an understatement. My nights were a collage of waking up at 2 a.m., trying to remember if the woman had red nails or tinted glass. I washed my face repeatedly and stared at the ceiling. Anxiety sits heavy in the chest and makes the world smell wrong. I found myself reorganizing closets to feel I had done something productive with my hands. Small rituals helped, making the bed each morning with precision, leaving a plant by the window and watering it on schedule. They were not cures, only anchors. Evidence began to arrive in the most modern of ways. A delivery confirmation photo that didn't belong to our house. A social media post where his smile looked staged next to someone who wasn't me. A photograph that matched the tiny hoop I'd found. I am not proud of the ways I obtained some of those confirmations. In the mess of grief and betrayal, people do things they would not always justify later. What I can say without offering a tutorial is that I gathered what I needed to know. Names, dates, images, things that turn suspicion into near certainty. I will be clear, I am not suggesting anyone follow my exact path. Some of those choices felt ethically slippery, and I acknowledge that now. One evening, as I sat with a mug of tea gone cold, my phone lit up with a message I didn't expect. It was from a woman named Bruna. She said she had seen one of the photos I'd posted in a private group, a photo I had shared late at night in a kind of whisper to other women, and she wanted to know if we could talk. When I met her, she smelled of lemon detergent and worry. Her hands were restless in the way of someone who has practiced speech in her head 100 times before saying it out loud. Bruna told me her story in fragments. A husband who changed the locks on emotional honesty, receipts that appeared at odd addresses, laughter that felt borrowed. As she spoke, I realized we were not speaking about the same man purely by coincidence. We were both in orbit around a man who had learned to live two lives side by side, and the gravitational pull had finally dropped something solid into view. At first, meeting her felt like stepping into a foreign country and recognizing the map. We compared dates quietly, without melodrama. There was a moment, absurd and very human, when I showed her the tiny hoop earring I had kept in a jewelry box in the bottom drawer. She traced the curve with a fingertip and then, softly said, "That is the one." We both laughed at our own survival. Laughter that had the edges of a sob. We did not rush to confrontation. We considered it, like reading a book's last chapter early. It would have hollowed out our options. Instead, we planned. Not to humiliate, but to reveal. There is a difference. Humiliation seeks to wound for its own sake. Revelation seeks to restore truth so that healing can begin. Our plan was a calibrated truth-telling, public enough to be undeniable, private enough to stay within the bounds of dignity. For weeks we collected evidence not as voyeurs but as witnesses to our own lives. There were delivery photos that placed him at places he had denied, screenshots of messages that were not romantic pornographic flourishes, but intimate scheduling and jokes that had nothing to do with my marriage. Ordinary threads of intimacy that, when multiplied, revealed pattern. There were posts where he performed an image of a perfect family while his other life was staged behind the curtain. I kept telling myself the difference between secrecy and choice. His secrecy was a choice that involved other people without their consent. Planning the reveal was the part where my carefulness paid off. We chose his birthday because it was the night he would gather all the people who believed the version of him he curated. He loved gatherings where his charm could circulate like currency. We booked a seemingly innocuous slideshow, photos celebrating milestones, travel, anniversaries, something he would have expected and enjoyed. Only the slides were not all of the curated life. Some were pieces of truth. The night of the party, I wore a simple dress and did my hair the way I always had, neat, not dramatic. Bruna came in quietly, sitting 2 rows away. There were friends and colleagues and neighbors, faces that had known us both for years. My husband was at ease, circulating, pouring wine, telling a story that got laughs in the exact places he wanted them. He had never seemed better rehearsed for adult life than in that moment. When the lights dimmed, the screen flickered to life. The first slides were ordinary, the kids at the beach, the house at Christmas. Applause, someone calling out a joke. I felt my pulse tighten into a single drumbeat. Then the content shifted. The images became evidence in a slow, quiet sequence. A delivery photo with the wrong address, a screenshot of a message thread with affectionate familiarity that had nothing to do with me. A candid image of him in a car where a small gold hoop glinted at his companion's ear. The screen held them up like mirrors. You could hear the air change in the room as these pieces fit together. There was no melodramatic soundtrack, no screaming. The power of the moment was that people were forced to see, to reconcile their image of him with the facts before them. My husband's smile faltered. He tried to laugh it off at first, an old reflex, but the laughter died because the room had turned sober. A friend who used to clap him on the back looked away. Someone whispered into a phone. The performance that had sustained him all along could not survive the evidence. I remember looking at Bruna across the room when the last slide faded. She had a hand to her mouth. Somewhere near us a guest rose and left, then another. The social fabric, so effortlessly woven around his charm, began to unravel in small human ways. Not a theatrical burial, but a series of quiet exits. He stood up then, a man who suddenly understood that his carefully managed identity had been punctured in front of people he had always used as an audience. Bruna's husband Daniel, who had come reluctantly and been sitting in the back, walked forward. He did not shout. He put both hands on the table and said the one thing he could not have known to say until he had been shown what had been hidden. Is this true? When the truth is presented plainly, no accusations, only evidence, people are left to respond in the only ways that matter, with honest questions and with choices. My husband did not deny every detail. He first tried to minimize, then to deflect, then to apologize in a way that was meant to wrap around the easiest parts of him. It was too late. Apologies do not repair what has been denied for so long. Bruna confronted him quietly in the hall. That private conversation had the intensity of someone putting a hand on a flame and feeling the unavoidable pain. It was not performed in public. It was not part of my spectacle. It was two humans facing the collapse of a life they had been promised. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen doorway, feeling both excluded and strangely relieved that the private ruin was happening where it belonged, away from the fake adrenaline of a staged drama. After the party, many people messaged me. Some expressed disbelief, some offered support. There were those who took his side. His charm had built them as much as it had fooled others. But the momentum had shifted. Social consequences are not a mob. They are the result of people recalibrating their trust. He lost clients he had been close to, acquaintances who had accepted the better story because it had been comfortable. Bruna's marriage also crumbled. The other life collapsed into her home in ways that left her with more questions than answers. Daniel, stunned, left that night and sat in his car for a long time before he came in again, touching her shoulder as if to check she was solid. What followed was the legal, very ordinary dismantling of things. There were consultations and papers. I signed divorce documents in a small office with a soft light that turned everything beige and official. The legalities were not dramatic. They were administrative acts of cleanup after the storm. There was no cinematic courtroom battle, only the page-by-page separation of joint accounts and shared ownership. I wanted that finality because uncertainty was like a low-grade fever. Emotionally, the hardest work came afterward. I went to therapy because I needed a neutral place to put the pieces down and look at them without shame. Therapy taught me to name my limits, to hold grief and anger in separate hands and not let them smother each other. I joined a support group where other women told stories that slid eerily into mine. The same pattern of small betrayals arranged into a second life, the same shame at being deceived. I learned that betrayal is not a singular pathology. It is painfully common, and we were not alone. There were practical rituals that helped me feel myself again. I packed his clothes into boxes with a steady, almost ritual precision, not in fury, but as a symbolic reclaiming of space. I painted the spare room a calm green and moved the plant into the window where it could be seen from the kitchen. I changed the photos on the wall to images that reflected my new priorities. Friends at a sunrise hike, my mother laughing, a quiet street I walked when nights were still rough. Small changes became acts of sovereignty. Physically, I attended to things I could manage. I started going to bed at a set time. I cooked meals I liked. I let friends bring me soup and stayed in bed an extra half hour on mornings when the grief felt heavier. There was one thing that helped me feel less tethered to the raw edge of anxiety, a magnesium supplement that calmed my muscles and helped me sleep more regularly. It is only my personal testimony. I cannot promise anyone similar results, and this is not medical advice. If something like that seems helpful, speak with a healthcare professional first. One of the most unexpected sources of comfort came from women I had never met. After the reveal, dozens of messages appeared. I saw your story. Thank you. You gave me the courage to leave. Others sent photos of their own tiny gold hoops, ordinary objects that had become, for them, evidence of an unspoken betrayal. Solidarity arrived in the form of texts at odd hours, invitations to coffee, and eventually a new group of friends who knew what reparation looked like. There was something profoundly healing about being recognized in my pain and not being told to shrink. I do not pretend it has been easy. Sometimes still, there is an involuntary backslide, a moment when I check my phone expecting a message that will never come, or when I walk past a car and feel my chest tighten. But those moments are not the whole of me. They are weather, storms that pass. Over time, the temperature of those storms changed. Grief softened. Anger, which once felt like fuel for a single combustible act, became a matter-of-fact energy used to set boundaries. People often ask me if I regret not confronting him at the traffic light. The answer is complicated. In the moment, a public confrontation would have been satisfying in its rawness. But what I needed then was clarity, not spectacle. The decisions I made afterward, quiet observation, careful collection of facts, the alliance with Bruna, were not about revenge. They were about reclaiming agency. When someone takes parts of your life without asking, the most radical act is to insist on the truth, calmly, and to live by it. There were costs for everyone involved. My husband lost standing in his community and eventually his marriage. Bruna lost a marriage as well, and with it the naive notion that exposure would magically fix things. Daniel carried bewilderment and a slow rebuilding. Friends had to choose where their loyalties lay, and some relationships ended because they could not reconcile the two versions of him. None of those consequences felt like punishment. they felt like the natural accounting that follows deception. A truth I have carried since then is that dignity does not require silence nor spectacle. It requires choice. We chose how we would respond. We chose to avoid a public scene that could have turned into a circus. We chose to present truth in a way that made it impossible to deny without becoming a crying, messy spectacle. We did not need to shame him to be heard. The clarity did the work. In private, my life rebuilt itself in small, stubborn ways. I learned to sleep without waiting for a call. I let myself feel nurtured by friends who sat with me without trying to fix me. I went on a weekend trip alone to a quiet seaside town where I rented a small room with a balcony and an ocean view. I bought a new set of dishes because the old ones reminded me of a life I had to unlearn. I went back to work with a steadier focus. Each small act was a stitch in a new garment I was learning to wear. Sometimes people ask, would you have done anything differently? Perhaps. Hindsight polishes decisions into cleaner shapes. I might have sought help earlier. I might have spoken to a lawyer before assembling evidence, simply to understand the legal boundaries of what I was doing. I might have reached out to Bruno sooner if I had understood the pattern of his behavior faster. But regret is not the same as wisdom. The path I took led me here. A woman who knows the pain of betrayal, but also knows the taste of survival. That knowledge is hard and luminous. One of the hardest parts of this whole experience was watching how the story changed in other people's mouths. Stories take on lives of their own. People told it with more venom than I had felt, as if vengeance were the only legitimate response. I never wanted that. I wanted restoration for myself and a refusal to be erased. When Bruna and I spoke afterward, we agreed on a principle: dignity over spectacle. She said, "We don't need to score points, we need to heal." That felt like a vow I could keep. The reach of the experience extended beyond me. Women sent messages saying that seeing someone handle betrayal without a meltdown gave them courage to seek truth in their own lives. That recovery did not require theatrical revenge brought me a kind of quiet pride. The solidarity I found among other women was one of the unexpected gifts, an ad hoc community of people who refuse to be isolated by shame. I do not spend my days thinking of revenge. Most days, his image is a footnote to the larger narrative I am writing now. The children are thriving in their own ways. We co-parent with as much grace as circumstances allow. There are practical challenges, scheduling, boundaries, the odd awkward holiday. But they are just part of the life we now carefully navigate. I do not pretend it is perfect, but it is honest. For anyone listening who recognizes some of themselves in this story, I want to say this: you do not have to perform your pain. You do not have to be a public spectacle to be believed. There is power in quiet decisions and in gathering the truth so you can see what you are building your next chapter out of. Seek counsel, legal, medical, and emotional, so your steps are grounded in safety. Reach out to people who hold your dignity rather than feed your anger. And remember that solidarity exists. You are not the only one. If this story resonates with you and you want more real-life experiences about dignity and comeback, subscribe. It helps to hear other people's paths so you can find the parts that feel like home. Months into the legal process, as paperwork moved along with its peculiar bureaucratic kindness, I found a kind of stillness I could not have imagined at that traffic light. There were days where I watered the plant and thought of how small, patient things survive. There were mornings when my coffee smelled like promise. There were friends who became family and new routines that felt both healthy and stubbornly ordinary. I have kept a few things from that life as memorials, not to what was, but to what I learned. One of them is the small gold hoop I found in the glove compartment. I do not wear it. It sits in a box with a note I wrote to myself months after the reveal. You chose dignity. You chose truth. Oddly, that note has become less accusatory and more like an anchor, a reminder of the person who navigated the impossible and surfaced. Healing is not a line. It is a terrain with rivers and cliffs and gentle plateaus. There are seasons where the climb is steep and others where you walk a long sunlit ridge. That ridge is built with friends who stay, therapists who guide, small practices that soothe, and the courage to name what you need and ask for it. There is also the slow work of restoring identity, finding the person you are outside the story you were in. If you are in the middle of something similar, know that taking action does not require you to become somebody else. You can be calm and firm. You can choose exposure where it serves truth, and choose quiet where it serves healing. You can ask for help. You can write your own ending. And if you have a friend who needs to hear that right now, share this story with them. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is hand someone else the simple knowledge that they are not alone.